To reject the resurrection, you must explain the empty tomb, the missing body, the eyewitness claims, the rapid spread of Christianity, the transformation of skeptics, the willingness to die for the claim. And do it better than the resurrection explains it, because something happened, not in myth, not in legend, but in history. And whatever that something was, it changed the world permanently. And before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who doesn't run from difficult questions, if you actually want to understand what's true, then don't just watch this silently, like this video. Because most people won't. Most people avoid questions like this because they're uncomfortable. And if you're still here right now, you're already different. This is not a sermon, and I'm not asking you to believe anything. Not yet. This is an investigation. We're going to take every major explanation, every alternative theory, and test it. Logically, historically, psychologically, and even theologically. Because if the resurrection didn't happen, then something else did. And whatever that something was, it has to explain everything you just heard. And that's where things start to fall apart. It starts with a place, not a legend, not a symbol, a real place, a tomb, cut into stone, cold, silent, unmoving, the kind of place that doesn't invite questions. It ends them. This is where stories stop. This is where bodies stay. This is where history is supposed to close the door. And inside that tomb was the body of a man the Roman Empire had just executed. Publicly, brutally, decisively. This wasn't hidden. This wasn't debated. This wasn't uncertain. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in front of witnesses, crowds, soldiers, authorities. Everyone saw it. And Rome did not make mistakes when it came to death. Crucifixion wasn't just punishment. It was precision. It was final. They didn't almost kill people. They didn't think someone was dead. They made sure. And when it was over, his body was taken down, lifeless, heavy, broken, wrapped carefully in burial cloth, prepared for what comes next. Not resurrection, burial, finality. He is placed inside that tomb. The stone is rolled into position, sealed, closed, finished. And in that moment, everything about this story should have ended. No movement, no message, no future, just another execution, forgotten by time. But it didn't end, because by the next morning, something was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not confusing. Wrong in a way that doesn't fit into normal explanations. The stone was no longer where it should have been, moved, shifted, out of place, and not just cracked open, but removed, and the body was no longer where it had been laid. Gone. Not relocated, not explained. Gone. Let that sit for a moment. A sealed tomb, a confirmed death, a guarded site, and now, no body. The tomb was empty. And this is where the tension begins, because an empty tomb is not something you can ignore. It doesn't quietly sit in history. It demands an explanation. Now think about that. An empty tomb, no body, no clear answer. No explanation that fully holds together under pressure. And if you're watching this right now, and you still don't know what to believe, that's exactly why this matters. Because this is the point where most people look away. Not because there's no evidence, but because the implications are uncomfortable. So before we go further, subscribe right now. Not out of habit, not because it's what people say, but because you're choosing to actually face the question. Most people won't do that. Most people scroll, avoid, ignore, because it's easier. And if you choose not to subscribe, then don't just move on quietly. Be honest. Go into the comments and say why. Because silence is comfortable, but it doesn't mean you've answered anything. Because ignoring a question doesn't make it disappear. It just delays the moment. You have to face it. And this is where the real problem begins. Not for believers, for anyone trying to explain this away. Because an empty tomb doesn't automatically prove a resurrection. That's true, but it creates a problem, a serious one. Because once the body is gone, every natural explanation starts to collapse. If the body is still there, you can end the story instantly. Produce it, show it, shut everything down. But if the body is gone, then now you have to explain who took it, why, how, and most importantly, why no one could ever bring it back. And that is where every alternative explanation begins to break. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because the moment you accept one fact, that the tomb was empty, you've stepped into a question that refuses to let you go. So the first explanation appears. Simple, direct, almost convenient. The disciples stole the body. It's not a modern idea. It didn't show up centuries later. It's ancient. One of the earliest attempts to explain what couldn't be ignored. And at first glance, it sounds reasonable. It feels logical. It feels grounded. It feels like the kind of explanation we're used to accepting. Because we live in a world where things don't just disappear. Bodies don't vanish. Stories don't rewrite themselves. So when something doesn't make sense, the human instinct is to reach for the closest explanation that does. And this one feels close enough until you slow it down and really look at it. Not emotionally, not casually, but step by step. Like an investigator, like a jury, like someone who actually wants the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Because the moment you slow this theory down, it starts to crack. Hours earlier, these same disciples were not planning anything. They weren't strategizing. They weren't organizing. They weren't preparing for a mission. They were hiding behind closed doors, lights low, voices down, whispering, watching every movement, every sound, every footstep outside. Because the man they followed had just been executed, publicly, brutally. And in their minds, they were next. This wasn't confidence. This wasn't courage. This was fear, real fear. The kind that makes you stay quiet, stay hidden, stay alive. These are not men preparing for a heist. These are men trying to survive the night. And yet, this theory asks you to believe something extraordinary. That within hours, these same men who were too afraid to stand near a cross suddenly became bold enough to approach a guarded tomb. Not just approach it, but challenge it. Because that tomb wasn't just sitting there unprotected. It was sealed, watched, secured. And now you have to imagine not these same terrified men walking straight into that situation, in the dark, under risk, under pressure, moving a massive stone, not quietly, not easily, but deliberately, taking a body, handling it, carrying it, and then disappearing into the night, without being stopped, without being caught, without leaving behind anything that would immediately expose them. And if you're listening to this carefully, you should feel something right now. Not certainty, not clarity, but tension. Because this isn't just unlikely. It's inconsistent. It doesn't match who they were just hours earlier. And this is where something deeper kicks in, something psychological. Because as humans, especially in a culture like the United States, We value explanations that feel realistic, consistent, coherent. We believe in evidence. We believe in investigation. We believe in asking, does this actually make sense all the way through? And this is where most people stop thinking. They hear one explanation. The body was stolen, and it sounds good enough. So they move on. Because it removes the discomfort. It gives the mind something to settle on. But if you're still here, then you're not like most people, because you didn't move on. You stayed. You kept listening, which means something about this isn't sitting right with you. So share this video with someone who believes this theory, not to argue, not to prove a point, but to ask one question. Does this actually hold up when you really think about it? Because most beliefs don't collapse under attack. They collapse under examination. And here's the part most people don't expect. Even if you accept all of that, even if you force yourself to believe that somehow they managed to steal the body, you've only solved the easiest part of the problem, because removing a body is one thing. Explaining everything that happened after is something else entirely. Because stealing the body doesn't explain what happened next, and that is where this theory completely falls apart. Now we get to the question most people avoid, not because it's complicated, but because it's uncomfortable. Why? Not how. Not could they. Why would they do it? Because every lie has a reason behind it. People don't risk everything for nothing. They lie for power, to gain influence, to control a narrative, to elevate themselves above others. They lie for money, to secure a future, to build something that benefits them. They lie for protection, to avoid consequences, to escape danger, to survive. That's how human behavior works. That's how we understand the world. That's how we make sense of people's actions, especially in a culture like the United States, where motive matters. Because in any courtroom, any investigation, any real search for truth, the question always comes back to one thing. What did they gain? So ask it, honestly, without bias, without assumption. What did the disciples gain? Not what you think they gained, not what it looks like from the outside. What did they actually gain? No wealth, no financial security, no hidden advantage, no protection, no safety, no system that shielded them from harm, no position that made their lives easier, no platform that elevated them above suffering. What they gained was the exact opposite. Beatings, arrests, public humiliation, exile, isolation, and eventually, execution. Let that settle in, because this is where the theory begins to collapse under its own weight. These were not men rising to power. These were men being crushed by the system around them. And still, they didn't change their story. Not once. Not when they were threatened. Not when they were imprisoned. Not when the cost became real. Because this is the moment where logic becomes personal. Let that sit with you. They gained nothing. They lost everything. And still, they didn't take it back. Now ask yourself something honestly. Not as a viewer, not as someone watching a video, but as a human being. If you knew something was a lie, something you created, something you could walk away from at any moment, would you suffer for it? Would you endure pain for it? Would you allow your life to be destroyed for something you knew wasn't true? Because this is where most explanations stop working. And if you can watch this, hear this, and not feel something shift inside you, then don't ignore that. Ask yourself why. Subscribe, not because it's what creators say, not because it's expected, but because you're choosing to stay in a conversation most people avoid. Because this kind of content isn't comfortable. It's not designed to entertain you. It's designed to confront you. And most people don't stay for that. They click away, they scroll past, they protect what they already believe. But if you're still here, then something about this is breaking through. Because the deeper you go into this question, the harder it becomes to ignore what it implies. Not once did they change their story. Not when it was easy. Not when it became difficult. Not when it cost them everything. Because people will die for something they believe is true. History is full of that. But people do not willingly suffer, do not endure, do not walk into death for something they know they created. And that is where this explanation begins to fall apart completely. Then come the claims, and this is where the conversation shifts, because, up to this point, you might still be trying to explain it away. You might still be thinking, maybe there's a simple answer. But this is where it becomes harder. Not emotionally, logically. Because now, you're not dealing with a single event. You're dealing with multiple, layered, independent, and consistent. It wasn't one person, not one isolated experience, not one moment that could be dismissed as confusion. It was many, different people, different personalities, different backgrounds, people who didn't think the same, didn't react the same, didn't expect the same outcome, different locations, not one controlled environment, not one setting where everything could be influenced, different moments spread out over time, not compressed into a single emotional experience, appearances to individuals, private, personal, moments that couldn't be easily verified, but also couldn't be easily dismissed, appearances to groups, multiple people seeing the same thing at the same time, and then one detail that changes everything. At one point, over 500 people at once. Now stop and think about that carefully, not casually, not emotionally, but logically. Because this is where the explanation starts to break under pressure. You can dismiss one person. People can be mistaken. You can even question a small group. Shared emotion, group influence, expectation. But 500 people at once, seeing the same thing? Now you're not just dealing with possibility, or you're dealing with probability, because the larger the number, the harder it becomes to dismiss. And here's what makes it even more difficult. This belief didn't grow slowly. It didn't evolve over generations. It didn't take decades to form. It appeared immediately. Right in the same place it could be challenged. Right in the same place it could be exposed. Right in the same place it could be shut down instantly, if it wasn't true. And that matters. Because false stories don't usually begin at the point of maximum resistance. They grow over time. They spread where they can't be easily tested, but this one didn't. It started at ground zero, where everything could be questioned, where everything could be disproven, and still, it didn't disappear. So the next explanation comes in. Hallucinations. And again, at first glance, it sounds reasonable. Because we understand the human mind, we know people can see things, feel things, experience things that aren't there. But once again, you have to follow it all the way through. Hallucinations are personal. They happen inside the mind. They are not shared experiences. They are not identical across groups. They are not synchronized. They don't happen to multiple people in the same way, at the same time. and they don't move across locations. They don't repeat consistently. They don't appear in structured patterns. So now you have to stretch the explanation. You have to assume multiple individuals and groups and even large crowds all experience the same hallucination in different places at different times with consistent outcomes. And even if you accept that, even if you push that explanation as far as it can go, you still haven't solved the core problem. Because hallucinations don't remove bodies. They don't roll away stones. They don't leave tombs empty. You can try to explain the experience, but you still haven't explained the missing body. And this is where the tension tightens. Because at this point, you're no longer dealing with a single theory. You're dealing with a pattern that keeps repeating, a pattern that keeps pointing, a pattern that doesn't fully resolve, no matter how you approach it. And patterns like that demand an explanation. Like this video if you've made it this far, not out of habit, but because you've stayed through a conversation. Most people don't finish. Most people click away the moment something challenges what they believe, the moment things stop being comfortable. But if you're still watching, then something about this is getting through. And that's exactly where this starts to matter, because the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to explain this away without confronting what it might actually mean. Then something changes, and it's not subtle, it's not gradual, it's not the kind of shift you can ignore or explain away easily. It's immediate, visible, and undeniable, because when you look at these men, before everything happened and after, you're not looking at the same people. Before, there is fear, real fear, the kind that shuts you down, the kind that makes you disappear. They are not standing publicly. They are not making bold declarations. They are not organizing movements. They are hiding behind locked doors, watching, waiting, trying not to be seen, because the man they followed was just executed, and in their minds, they were next. This wasn't confidence, this wasn't courage, this was survival. And then something happens and everything changes. After, there is boldness, not careful boldness, not calculated boldness, unfiltered, public, unapologetic boldness. They step out. They speak openly. They declare something that puts them at risk immediately. And not just to friends, not just in safe spaces, but in the same environment where their leader was just killed. That's not normal behavior. Then comes clarity. Before, confusion, questions, doubt, uncertainty about what any of this meant. After, certainty. Not speculation, not guessing, not hoping. Certainty. The kind of certainty that removes hesitation. And then, conviction. Not shallow belief, not emotional excitement, not temporary inspiration. Conviction that holds under pressure. Conviction that doesn't fade when challenged. Conviction that stays, even when it costs everything. And this is where the explanation starts to collapse again, because people can be mistaken. People can be confused. People can even be deceived. But this kind of transformation, from fear to fearless, from silence to public declaration, from hiding to willingly stepping into danger, requires a cause, a real one, a sufficient one. Because behavior like this doesn't come from nothing. And this is the key question. What happened that was powerful enough to produce that kind of change? See, not just belief, not just hope, but certainty strong enough to override fear. Because fear is one of the strongest human instincts, especially in a culture like ours, where safety, stability, and self-preservation matter deeply. People don't willingly move towards suffering. They avoid it. They escape it. They protect themselves from it. But these men did the opposite. They didn't just accept risk. They walked into it. They spoke publicly. They refused to back down. They held their position, even when it became clear what it would cost them. And this is where it becomes personal. Because now the question isn't just about them, it's about you. If you knew something wasn't true, if you knew it was built on a lie, would you stand in front of people and defend it? Would you continue when opposition came? Would you stay when it started costing you something real? Or would you step back, reevaluate, protect yourself, walk away? Because that's what most people do. That's what makes sense. But they didn't. And that forces a question you can't ignore. What did they see that made fear lose its power? Because these men don't act like people protecting a lie. They act like people who are certain enough to speak publicly, certain enough to suffer, certain enough to lose everything, and ultimately certain enough to die. And that kind of certainty doesn't come from imagination. It comes from conviction rooted in something real. And once you reach that point, the explanation gets harder, not easier. Because now, you're not just explaining an event, you're explaining a transformation. And transformations like this don't happen without a cause strong enough to create them. And then, there are the ones who didn't believe. Not outsiders, not strangers, not people far removed from the situation, the ones closest to it, the ones who had the most reason not to believe. Because if there was anyone who could see through a lie, it would be them. Start with James, not a follower, not a disciple, not someone caught up in the movement. James was his brother. He grew up with him. Same home, same environment, same ordinary moments. And that matters, because familiarity does something to belief. It removes illusion. It removes distance. It removes the ability to exaggerate someone into something they're not. If anything, it makes belief harder. Because it's one thing to hear about someone from a distance. It's another thing entirely to grow up with them, to see them in everyday life, to know their routines, their patterns, their humanity. And yet, James didn't follow him. Not at first. He wasn't convinced. He wasn't persuaded. He wasn't standing with the disciples. And because whatever was happening wasn't enough to convince him. And then, something changed. Not gradually, not over time, not through influence or pressure. Something happened that flipped his entire position, from skepticism to leadership, from distance to commitment, from disbelief to conviction strong enough to die for. And that's where the question begins. What happened that could convince someone that close? Because it's easy to persuade strangers. It's easy to influence crowds, but convincing someone who knows you, someone who has seen you in ordinary life, that takes something else, something undeniable. And then there's Paul, and Paul is different. James was close. Paul was hostile, not indifferent, not neutral, an enemy. He wasn't confused. He wasn't searching. He wasn't open to being convinced. He was actively against it, hunting Christians, tracking them down, breaking the movement apart. Because this wasn't a man looking for truth. This was a man trying to stop it. He had a position, a belief system, a clear understanding of what he thought was right. And then, something happened, and everything reversed, not softened, not adjusted, not slightly reconsidered. Reversed. The same man who was hunting Christians becomes one of them. The same man who was trying to destroy the message becomes one of its strongest voices. The same man who stood against it now suffers for it. And again, you're forced into the same question. What happened? Because people don't just flip like that, especially not in a culture like ours, where identity matters, where beliefs are tied to reputation, where changing your position comes at a cost. People double down. They defend. They protect what they already believe. They don't abandon everything overnight. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Paul didn't gradually shift. He didn't slowly reconsider. He changed direction completely, and he paid for it. Loss, opposition, suffering. And still, he didn't go back. So now, you're not dealing with followers who were already convinced. You're dealing with skeptics and enemies, people who had no reason to believe, and yet they ended up in the same place. Conviction, commitment, willingness to suffer. And that creates a problem. Because if this was a lie, if this was constructed, if this was manipulated, then why did it convince the hardest people to convince? Not the emotional, not the easily persuaded, but the skeptical, the resistant, the opposed. Because when skeptics become convinced, something deeper is happening. Not influence, not pressure, experience, something they believed, they encountered. And that is where the explanation becomes even more difficult, because now you're not just explaining belief, you're explaining reversal. And reversals like this don't happen without a cause strong enough to force them. And then, something happens that changes everything. The movement spreads, not gradually, not quietly, not in the background, explosively, fast, uncontrolled, relentless. But here's what makes it disturbing. It doesn't spread in safety. It doesn't spread far away. It doesn't begin where it can't be challenged. It begins at the center, in the very place where Jesus was executed. The same city, the same streets, the same people, the same authorities who had just made sure he was dead. Think about that. Because movements built on falsehoods don't start there. They don't begin at ground zero. They don't grow where the evidence can be immediately checked. They don't expand in the one place where they can be shut down instantly. But this one did. It didn't move away from scrutiny. It moved into it, publicly, openly, without hesitation. And it spread under pressure, not encouragement, not support, not acceptance. Pressure, opposition, threats, resistance, persecution. Because this wasn't a message the system welcomed. It was a message the system tried to stop. And that's where the tension builds. Because now you're not just explaining an empty tomb. You're not just explaining eyewitness claims. Now you're explaining momentum. Growth that doesn't make sense. Expansion that shouldn't happen. Because if this wasn't true, if this was built on a lie, it collapses instantly. All it takes is one moment, one interruption, one undeniable piece of evidence, one body, displayed publicly, verified, confirmed, and everything ends. The message stops. The movement dies. The story disappears. Because no one is risking their life for something that can be disproven in seconds. And the people in power had every reason to do it. They had authority. They had control. They had motivation. This movement challenged them, threatened them, disrupted everything they had established. If there was a body, they would have used it. Immediately. Not later. Not eventually. Immediately. Because that's how you stop something like this. You don't argue with it. You don't debate it. You end it. With proof. But that moment never came. No body, no display, no final evidence. to shut it down. And because of that, the movement didn't slow down. It accelerated from a small group to a growing movement, from a local message to something that began to spread beyond its origin. Despite resistance, despite pressure, despite the cost, and now you're left with a question that doesn't go away. What allows something like that to grow in the exact environment designed to destroy it? Because movements built on lies don't survive direct opposition. They fade, they collapse, they disappear. But this one didn't. It grew. And growth like that, under those conditions, demands an explanation. And then, if you step back for a moment, if you stop looking at this as isolated events and start looking at it as a whole, you begin to see something else, something deeper, a pattern. Not something created after the fact, not something added later to make the story sound better, but something that was already there, long before the crucifixion, long before the tomb, long before anyone was trying to explain what happened. Written, embedded, waiting, because buried inside ancient texts, inside writings that predate these events, there are descriptions that start to sound familiar, not identical, not obvious at first glance, but consistent. A suffering servant, not a conquering king, not a political leader, a servant, rejected, misunderstood, opposed, a figure who suffers, who is broken, who is killed. And yet, the story doesn't end there. Because somehow, against expectation, against logic, against what should happen, he continues. And that's where the pattern begins to tighten, because death is supposed to be final. In every culture, in every system, in every understanding of reality, death is the end. It closes the story, it ends the movement, it removes the voice. But here, the pattern suggests something different, a body that does not decay, not abandoned, not forgotten, not left to time, but preserved. And when you place that idea next to what we've already seen, the empty tomb, the missing body, the eyewitness claims, the transformation, the movement, something begins to connect. Not perfectly at first, but clearly enough to raise a question. What if this wasn't unexpected? What if this wasn't a random event that people later tried to explain? What if it was something that had already been pointed to? Something that had already been described before it ever happened? Because that changes the nature of the conversation. Now you're not just explaining an event, you're explaining alignment, events, matching a pattern that already existed. And that's much harder to dismiss, because coincidence can explain one detail, maybe two. But when multiple pieces begin to line up, across time, across context, across expectation, it starts to look less like coincidence and more like intention. And this is where theology stops being abstract and starts becoming relevant. Because now you're not just asking, did something happen? You're asking, was this meant to happen? Was this the kind of outcome that had already been written into the framework of the story? And if it was, then the resurrection isn't just an isolated claim. It's a fulfillment, the completion of something that had been building quietly long before anyone realized what it meant. And if that's true, then this isn't just about explaining the past. It's about understanding what that pattern was pointing to all along. So now, we return to the beginning. To reject the resurrection, you must explain the empty tomb, the missing body, the eyewitnesses, the transformation, the movement, the martyrs. And you must explain all of it better than the resurrection does, because every alternative solves one piece and collapses under the rest. And if the resurrection is true, then this is not just history. It means death was not the end. It means everything Jesus said was true. And it means the question is no longer, did it happen? The question becomes, what do you do with it? If this made you uncomfortable, good. That means you were paying attention, because the most dangerous thing is not disbelief, it's indifference. Comment below. What do you think really happened? And if you're not subscribing, don't just scroll away. Be honest. Explain why. Because at some point, everyone has to answer this question. The only difference is, some people face it now, and others wait until they can't ignore it anymore. Also, watch what Jesus went to do 3 days before his resurrection. I have linked it at the end of this video. Share this video to a friend, like, share and subscribe to this channel. In doing so, you are helping spread the gospel to many nations across the world. I will see you in the next video. Good night and God bless you.